Medardo Rosso, Inventing Modern Sculpture, is a collaboration with Kunstmuseum Basel and the Mumok in Vienna. It was curated by Heike Eipeldauer and myself, Elena Filipovic, and spans the whole gamut of influence and impressions and thinking that Medardo Rosso had, both in his lifetime and through to the present. Medardo Rosso is probably the most influential and important sculptor of the late 19th century that you've probably never heard of. In fact, I've found that so many people, art lovers, art collectors, that may be well informed about the development of modern sculpture, don't realize how influential a figure like Medardo Rosso has been to the development and the history of modern sculpture. The turning of a figurative sculpture into something abstract, into something that leans, something that isn't straight necessarily, isn't vertical, doesn't stand as we think modern sculpture really took a turn, and Medardo Rosso was part of that turn. In this room, at the very beginning of this Medardo Rosso retrospective, we show Rosso's work on historic pedestals that Rosso himself would have shown his work on. We show more than 250 of his photographs, as well as drawings, photographs of his drawings, and show the way in which he really reflected on reproduction, on technology, on how these modern forms had an impact on sculptural practice. Here you really see how many artists are included in the exhibition. It's more than 60. It includes Rosso's contemporaries, but also our own. It's a show that dares, across its 7 different chapters and 2 sort of sections, to present Rosso first, monographically, on his historic plinths, and then in these upstairs spaces to present Rosso with different themes that connect to his work. For instance, in this first room, repetition and variation, where you see 6 different heads that Medardo Rosso sculpted, each one materially or formally slightly different, although they're supposed to be casts of the same. You see how much Rosso was busy with and preoccupied with the idea of reproduction, but also with aura and uniqueness. And so he managed to take his most popular motif, but to make it every time a bit different. The way the child leans, the way the head tilts, each is different. And when we think of questions of seriality, repetition, reproduction, one has to think of artists like Andy Warhol, like Sherry Levine, who made this a center point of their own thinking. Across the 7 chapters of the exhibition, we explore different themes that were central to Rosso's thinking. In this room, anti-monumentality is the topic, where you see how Rosso really dealt with creating forms that undo our ideas of what sculpture should look like. Here, 4 examples of his bookmaker sculpture. We have plaster versions, bronze versions. Each one you see tilts and leans and looks like it's completely unstable. If we'd only had one example, a visitor might suspect that something in the process had melted or kind of broken, and that's why these figures lean so precariously. But when you see 4, each slightly different, but each conveying this essential idea of fundamental instability, you realize this was something at the core of Rosso's thinking. Throughout the exhibition, we've also managed to bring in a number of works from the Kunstmuseum Basel's own collection. It gives a chance for these works to be seen anew, to be seen in a new context. This theme, performance and process, allows us to underline how important The idea for Rosso was of creating something alive, something living, something that wasn't simply static as sculpture, and therefore bringing together, on the one hand, a work like Linda Benglis's dramatic latex spill of color, or alongside Rosso's capturing of a moment of laughter, or a moment of a smile, this fleeting moment in sculpture. And we bring it together with works as different as Senga Ngudi's trace of a process of performance that she began already in the 70s, or Loie Fuller's dance. It was called the Serpentine Dance. It would have been simultaneous to the Rosso sculptures we include in the exhibition. It was a cultural sensation in Paris at the time, and most likely Rosso himself saw it. In this room, we brought together works that have to do with touching and shaping. It was really anchored on a work of Medardo Rosso's where he brought together this portrait of his wife and his son. And you see that it's almost like a Pygmalion image, where the child and mother morph and fuse into one another, where the hand of the mother almost pushes into the flesh of this child. It almost becomes a metaphor for sculpture itself, for the way in which the sculptor reproduces life, in this case quite literally. And it became a leitmotif that for many of the works in this exhibition, as diverse as Louise Bourgeois' Child Devoured by Kisses, a work where maternal love and suffocation come together, where you're not sure if it's sinister or if it's pleasurable. The child is sort of being smothered by love. Here we have this amazing array of 4 examples of Rosso's essai puer. The very last sculptural motif that he made in his lifetime. We know that from 1906, the year of this sculpture, to the end of his life, he stopped making new motifs. Instead, he returned again and again and again to motifs that he had started before, and he resculpted them and then recast them and he changed them. In this case, we have an example in wax, in painted plaster, 2 in bronze, which show you how much, although these look like repetitions of the same, each is subtly different, each has a different backside, one leans radically differently than the others, the position of their nose shifts. It's a really beautiful example of the way that Rosso worked in sculpture. The last section was on the theme of appearance and disappearance, and this room continues that, where you really see the way in which influence and dialogue plays out in Rosso's sculpture. This one, Bambino Malato in bronze, next to Brancusi's Sleeping Muse. And you see the way in which their reflections on form were shared, and also the reflections on photography. Brancusi credited Rosso as being influential for his thinking about the importance of photographing his work and thinking of the photography as almost a sculptural act. There's a work in the exhibition, Felix Gonzalez Torres's untitled Portrait of Ross in LA, that was really important for me to include in the exhibition because it is a candy pile that is a portrait of Felix's partner at the time, who was living through and actually slowly dying from AIDS. And Felix made this incredibly generous, fun, beautiful, loving portrait in the sense of a pile of candies that everyone is invited to take from, to touch, to eat. And there's this beauty in its generosity. But as it's slowly taken from, as the visitors visit the exhibition, it's also a portrait of loss. It's a portrait that disappears. It's a portrait that plays in the same way that Rosso's do, with the kind of way in which a form is represented and slowly comes out of view or out of appearance. In this room, we really emphasize how important framing, mise en scène, thinking about context is crucial to understanding Rosso. This is something you really see in the photographs of Rosso's work, how much he was busy thinking about context and framing. And so, of course, the show doesn't mean to articulate that Francis Bacon was inspired by Rosso, but rather that the same kind of thinking that finds itself in Bacon's work, where he was so interested and indeed obsessed with creating these frames within frames, almost like bodily cages in his painting, echoes with something like the work of Robert Gober or Paul Tech, where each is taking something extremely bodily, whether a representation of a torso or of raw meat, and framing it in these cases. The last two rooms of the exhibition actually bring together one sort of chapter, one thematic idea, and that is the Ungestalt, or form undone. So central to the way Rosso was thinking about how to be truly modern. It's combined in a room where we see the sort of amazing experiments of Hannah Williger, where body parts are revealed, her own body, that speak of fragility, of mortality, of everything that Rosso himself was also trying to capture in his own sculpture. You notice that as you walk through the exhibition, there's nothing of monumental scale. There's nothing that's really larger than life itself. The sculptures, nearly all of them, could fit within your arms. The very last work in the exhibition is one that speaks volumes about Rosso's way of thinking about making. Here, it's Enfant au sein. It's a child at the breast. It's the classical mother-child motif. But here, when you stand in front of it with an audience and you ask them, what do you see? They very often at first don't know what they're looking at. It really takes time before you kind of recognize, and it becomes legible, that these are two arms of the mother sort of holding up its child. You start to recognize the little elbow and the hand of the child at its mother's breast, and the face of the child in what looks like a volcanic explosion of lava or a ragged rock. You don't recognize it as figurative sculpture. And I'm thrilled that this last work in the exhibition is now in the collection of Kunstmuseum Basel. Rosso was always thinking about how to be together with others in a presentation mode. How the context that you build as an artist around your work says something about your own radicality or kinship. We took this principle in the exhibition, also even in a room like this one, the concourse between the Hauptbau and the Neubau of our museum. And we installed this remarkable sculptural work called 11 by Kari Upson. For me, it resonates so much with Rosso's thinking about how do you give form to something that is repeated, but every time different. It begins already in the inner courtyard of the Hauptbau, where I thought it's not possible to have a Rosso retrospective start without having a response to Rodin's Burghers of Calais that sit kind of since the moment they arrived in the inner courtyard of the Kunstmuseum. And so here we have this remarkable retort, this response to Rodin, this response to modern sculpture as something solid and stable in the form of Pamela Rosenkranz's Skin Pool. It's pink, it's flesh-like, it's ever-moving. It's a reflection on flesh it's reflection on the bodily, and it's an attempt to make sculpture that is alive. And these are all things that Rosso was deeply preoccupied with.